Welcome back to Teen Story Share. We are reading today our last chapter of The Bones of Birka, Unraveling the Mystery of a Female Viking Warrior by C.M. Surrisi. And I promised you chapter 6 today. If you missed chapters 1 through 3, those will be linked down below. And we're skipping 4 and 5 just to get to more of the information about the actual skeleton in the grave. Chapter 6. Archaeologists weigh in on the Birka warrior. Over 100 years after Stolpe, archaeologist Anna Källström examined the bones of the person in grave BJ 581. But unlike Stolpe, she didn't assume anything about the sex of the person buried in BJ 581. She examined it morphologically. When she was done, she believed the skeleton was female. Arriving at this conclusion was a long path for Källström. Dr. Anna Källström, osteologist. When Anna Källström was young, she hung out with friends, shot free throws on the basketball court, and practiced Mozart on the flute. That is, until she was given a book about the Black Death, the horrendous plague of the Middle Ages. Something gripped her in the tale of a disease that could rage through a population and kill millions of people. She read that book over and over. When she was studying archaeology at Uppsala University, she and other students were observing a cathedral restoration when workers unexpectedly uncovered bones. Anna was drawn to the scene and wanted to see more, do more, and be more closely involved in finding out everything about those bones. To her, they were people. They once walked around, laughed, and loved, and the events of their lives were written in their remains. Källström earned a bachelor's degree, master's degree, and doctorate in archaeology, with a specialty in osteology. That's a lot of bones, bones, bones. She is now a director and associate professor of osteology at Stockholm University. During her years of study and practice since 1991, she has authored many chapters and articles, edited books and articles, developed courses, taught and researched in the field of bioarchaeology. She even performed forensic assignments for the Swedish police, acting as special advisor on the skeletal remains from the 17th century Swedish battleship Kronen for the Kalmar Museum. By the time the bones of BJ 581 lay before her, she had examined thousands and thousands of bones. How Källström does her morphological examinations. Anna Källström says her examination depends on the condition of a skeleton. She's examined skeletons where she has all or most of the bones, and she has also examined only fragments. Other times the bones are charred bits. Most times they are fragments and the preservation is poor. Källström begins by laying the bones on a table. If the skeleton is complete or close to complete, she places them in the order they would be on a body. If they are all or mostly there, she can do this easily. If they are fragmented, it can take hours. If bones are from a funeral pyre, she can work for weeks sorting them. When I have them laid out and in the best anatomical order, I select the bones that carry the most information and examine them, she explained. I take measurements, assess age traits, stature, teeth, and so on. I take lots of pictures as I try to understand what's gone on with this person. I look for anomalies that will reveal disease, injury, repetitive use, and I decide upon chemical testing if there are funds available. Osteologists record in spreadsheets what they see. For example, when Källström examines bones for a multi-person project, she opens a database for the project and enters her measurements and impressions as she goes along. It is an inventory of her scientific observations. From these data entries and tables, she could compare individuals and identify trends across populations. In 2009, Källström created the People in Transition project. She sought insight into a particular population's cultural behavior, such as religious rituals, plagues and diseases, or wars and battle scars. She planned to examine graves from 3 locations: Sigtuna, the earliest Swedish town, the nearby rural Mälaren Valley, and Birka, a close island trading town. These areas overlap geographically, and the time period selected for each was similar. At least in theory, some of the individuals she would study could have actually met during their lifetimes. Certainly it made for good comparisons. Källström was the first osteologist to examine the entire Birka collection in more than 3 decades. Many of the graves were poorly preserved, resulting from soil pressure, soil drainage, and other factors. Additionally, it did not help that the collection had been moved and repackaged over the years. Why would a museum's grave collections be moved? In the case of the Swedish History Museum, curators relocated the collection in anticipation of the completion of a new museum. Also, during wartime, they transferred precious artifacts to the museum's basement to protect them. The individual grave contents were also repackaged several times at the museum, from less preservative containers to more protective containers. They went from drawers to plastic bags, from plastic bags to boxes, and so on as the technology improved. Unfortunately, some remains were mixed up during these transfers. For example, one grave was registered as having a single person, but the container had the bones of more than one person. Källström considered some of these graves questionable and rejected them from the study of individual graves. She didn't ignore them entirely, though. They were considered still representative of the population and were of great interest in the larger analysis of the community. Fortunately, some of the graves had bone material that was consistent with Stolpa's descriptions and drawings. Källström was able to identify a group of 236 individual graves with sufficient bone material to examine. Within the 236, some were better preserved than others. BJ 581 was one of the better ones. It was considered in good condition. The BJ 581 box had minimal impact from the many moves and was one of the most intact collections of grave contents. However, one curiosity was that its cranium had been removed. A second oddity was that a single femur with the marking BJ 854 had found its way into the box sometime after the 1940s and Holger Arbmann's time. Källström noted, "I registered the bones with all the others, but I commented that it deviated from the rest. Everything else in the case matched the original Stolpa drawings, inventory, notes, and journals of the grave BJ 581. Källström wasn't the first osteologist to look at the BJ 581 bones, or to note the stray femur in the box. In the 1970s, an osteologist named Berit Wilkans had examined the BJ 581 bones and also saw the femur. Wilkans compared the bones to the Stolpa drawing and found that they were the correct ones for the grave. But when she saw the odd femur, she questioned whether there had been 2 bodies in the grave. When she made a sex determination, she did not consider the odd-numbered femur, but based her finding on, among other things, the fragment of left-sided female pelvis marked for BJ 581. Some people in Swedish archaeological circles were aware of her findings, but they didn't draw attention, perhaps because of their unpublished nature, or the fact that osteology is considered observational and not conclusive as to sex, or the confusion of the stray femur, or that she was a female scientist, or maybe all these things combined. There is the mystery femur. Källström's assessment. Källström approached the BJ 581 box just as she had every other assessment, using recognized methods to estimate age and sex based on aspects of the pelvis and lower jaw and measurements of the humerus and femur. I examined every bone from grave BJ 581 and found that not only were the human bones labeled with the grave number, so were the horse's bones and most of the artifacts, including the weapons and game pieces. There was a lower jaw, a complete spine, humerus, forearms, hip bones and lower extremities, and partial feet. They shared the same character and color on the surface. I laid out the bones in the sitting order to match the drawing. Generally, the bones were poorly preserved and there weren't many features that I could look at. The epiphyseal union was completed on all preserved bones, and the appearance of the auricular surface of the left hip bone met the morphological criteria for Phase 3, which is different morphological criteria associated with age changes. The dental wear on the lower molars was clear but moderate. In all, this suggested that the individual was above 30 years of age. Here's the bones that were analyzed. And here they are laid out in the sitting order. Okay, and I looked up the epiphyseal union in the glossary here at the end of the book, and it says they are loose secondary centers of bones that consist primarily of the joint portion of the bone elements. The timing of epiphyseal union for different bone elements is well documented and helps when trying to estimate the age of a young individual. Additionally, the long bones were thin, slender, and gracile, which provided further indirect support for the assessment. I observed no significant skeletal alternations or changing bone patterns, although I documented degenerative changes in the form of osteophytes, bony lumps, on the ventral bodies or the thoracic vertebra, and marginal lipping, or overgrowth of bone, and surface pitting of the apophyseal facet joints, spine joints that allow flexibility, of the third to fifth lumbar vertebra. Additionally, the distal part of the medial side of the diaphysis of the tibia, bones between the knees and ankles, exhibited mild periosteal new bone formation. I observed no pathological or traumatic injuries. The greater sciatic notch of the hip was broad, and wide preauricular sulcus was present. This, together with the lack of a projection of the mental eminence on the mandible, assessed the individual as female. I concluded the skeleton was very highly likely to be female. Okay, why did Shellstrom qualify her assessment as very highly likely female rather than female? Osteologists often hedge their bets when they make a sex assessment because the assessments are based on human morphology, human observation, which can to some extent vary between people and which is not considered to be absolute. They are observations, expert scientific observations, but in the end, only observations. Shellstrom got a second and a third opinion. Because this was such a famous grave that had been assumed male for over a century, and because it was good practice, Shellstrom asked 2 other osteologists to do independent blind assessments. Without telling them what she had found or what the record reflected, she asked osteologist Petra Molnar and Elin Allen Sundman to assess the skeleton. They each separately and independently came up with the same conclusion. The person was very highly likely to be female. Shellstrom didn't set out to wake up a female Viking warrior, nor did she intend to vindicate Berit Vilkans. She was methodically going through a group of graves that were selected for the purposes of the People in Transition project, which included an effort to identify sex, and well, there it was. So what to do about it? She elected not to deviate from her original purpose. The documentation went into the larger database, just as for all the skeletons, so the data could be used for various purposes. Later, when she wrote the paper for the entire project, she called it out because it was interesting, though she knew it would raise eyebrows. I knew it would be controversial since it was about a chamber grave where striking equipment, consisting of, among other things, an axe, a sword, and 2 horses, have contributed to the archaeological interpretation that it was a man. That was not my focus in the People in Transition study, but I didn't want to ignore it because it was a significant grave. In the paper, she wrote, "Another interesting and possibly controversial find was a grave where the preserved bones do fit the original 19th century drawings and descriptions. This is a chamber grave furnished with fine armor and sacrificed horses. Nevertheless, 3 different osteological examinations all found that the individual was a woman." And because ethical osteologists always explicitly draw attention to any uncertainties the evidence may have identified, she added, "Whether these are the correct bones for this grave, or whether it opens up reinterpretations of weapons graves in Birka, it is too early to say." And that is Anna Shellstrom with the skeleton from the grave. BJ 581. Shellstrom says she added this to her report only because she had not yet completed the task of going through the inventory list and comparing it with the description in the archaeological record in a careful and consistent manner. But she and osteoarchaeologist and Professor Jan Stora completed that later, so in fact the contents of the box matched the Stolpa record. When Shellstrom presented the results at a conference in 2011, the reaction was mixed. One person said, "Wow," and another said, "That can't be." Others came up to her after the presentation with suggestions for alternate interpretations of the grave. She found this curious since her findings as to the bones were scientific sex assessments. For Shellstrom, the sex of BJ 581 was more a statistic than a social or gender implication. She had included the grave in her study because it fit the study's criteria. But the People in Transition project would not be the last Shellstrom heard of BJ 581. All right, if you want to learn more all about this famous grave and the female Viking warrior inside, you may want to check out this book from the library. Here's a quick glance at the next chapter. Wait, what? The famous Birka warrior really is female? All right, so if you want to dive into that, this book will be available for checkout in the teen room at the library. Have a great weekend and see you again next week with a brand new book. Bye.